Renata Bowers was 40 years old the morning her husband stood on the front porch in yesterday's clothes and rang the doorbell of the house he had lived in for 11 years, because none of his keys worked anymore. Everyone in Richmond who knew the Bowers family believed they understood the arrangement well enough. Renata managed logistics for a regional distribution company, drove a 9-year-old truck with a cracked dashboard and 200,000 miles on it, and packed the same thermos of coffee every morning from a machine she'd bought on clearance 6 years ago and had repaired twice herself rather than replace. Calvin's co-workers called her the one holding things together, which Calvin laughed at every time, because a wife people admired for her steadiness was a wife people never thought to look at too closely. She had called Calvin 14 times between 10 at night and 3 in the morning while he sat in a hotel bar 2 miles from their house with a woman named Simone from his sales team. A fact Renata did not yet know at 3 in the morning and did know with considerable precision by 7. The 14 missed calls had become, in the hands of a locksmith she'd called at 5 and a property attorney she'd called at 6. The first 2 documents in a file that would eventually cost Calvin Bowers far more than a night away from home. What Calvin never thought to ask, not once in 11 years of watching Renata hold everything together, was whose name sat alone on the deed to the house he was currently locked out of, or what the woman he'd always called just practical Renata had spent the last 4 years quietly converting his casual dismissal into. By the time he rang that doorbell, the answer to both questions had already been arranged. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. 3 weeks before that morning, on a Saturday, Renata had been in the detached garage behind the house reorganizing shelving units she'd built the previous spring. The same methodical weekend work she'd been doing since her grandmother May handed her a level and a drill at age 9 and said that a woman who could square a shelf could square anything else she put her mind to. The garage smelled of sawdust and machine oil the same way May's storage office always had, and working in it on a quiet Saturday had always felt to Renata less like chores and more like the closest available version of a conversation with a woman she still missed most on the days she had something worth thinking through. May had run a small storage and moving operation in Richmond for 30 years, 2 trucks and a handcart, and a reputation so reliable that her clients sent their adult children back to her when they had children of their own. And she had built most of her business on a single principle: you couldn't manage what you hadn't measured, and you couldn't measure what you hadn't documented. She kept a ledger for every account, a folder for every property, a dated receipt for every decision that might one day need to be explained to someone who hadn't been there to see it made. Renata had inherited the principal, the tool belt, and a commercial property on the south side of the city that May had left her through a will so precisely drawn that there was no version of it anyone could reasonably contest. Calvin had come out to the garage that afternoon with a glass of water she hadn't asked for, leaned in the doorway, and asked if she'd thought any more about the sales conference he needed to attend in 2 weeks. "You'll be fine for the weekend?" he asked, which was not quite the same question as whether she minded him going, and which carried the faint implication, familiar enough by now that she no longer remarked on it, that his schedule was the variable the household arranged itself around. She said she'd be fine. She handed him back the glass when she was done with it and went back to squaring the last bracket on the far shelf. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he stepped out of the doorway before he answered it, which she noted without comment, the same way she noted that the conference he'd mentioned was in a city 2 hours away, but his toothbrush had come back from his last overnight trip bone dry, and that the mileage on his car had logged 43 more miles than the hotel's address would account for. Only Renata's cousin Darlene, who ran the books for May's old commercial property under a management agreement they'd kept quiet, for the same reason May always kept her best assets quiet, and Renata's property attorney, a steady woman named Phyllis who had handled the estate transfer and 3 subsequent lease renewals without a single document out of order, knew the full picture of what Renata held in her own name, separate from the marriage. The commercial property alone was currently under a long-term commercial lease, generating more per month than Renata's salary at the distribution company, a fact she had never mentioned to Calvin in 11 years and had never needed to, because the account it flowed into had never once been joint. It wasn't concealment so much as a habit Renata had learned from May before she'd ever met Calvin. What you owned was your business, and only when someone else made it their business did you have occasion to explain it. She had met Calvin 12 years earlier at a logistics conference in Charlotte, where he'd presented a sales pitch for route optimization software that had 3 genuine ideas and 7 slides worth of confidence he hadn't fully earned yet. She'd told him as much, politely, during the Q&A, noting specifically which claims his data supported and which it didn't. And when the session ended, he'd found her in the hallway and bought her coffee and said she was the first person in 2 days to tell him anything true. Something about a man who could take correction gracefully, who leaned forward rather than retreating when he was challenged, had made her let her guard down further than usual, faster than usual. He was funny and precise when he chose to be, and for the first 4 years of the marriage those qualities had coexisted in a way that made the house feel like something they were building together rather than something she was maintaining alone. She married him 8 months after Charlotte, in May's backyard, beneath the same oak tree May had planted the year she bought the property, with 30 people in folding chairs and a cake Darlene baked herself, and a photograph on the mantelpiece she'd looked at with uncomplicated fondness until sometime around year 6, when looking at it started to require a small, quiet effort she hadn't needed before. That version of Calvin had been real. She had never doubted that. She had only slowly stopped believing his graciousness was still in there once his confidence had grown into something that no longer seemed to need her honesty. Her phone sat face up on the garage workbench that Saturday evening, and at 7:43 it lit up with a message from a number she didn't recognize, a short, careful text that read only, "I thought you should know," followed by a photo taken from the parking lot of a bar across town. The photo showed Calvin's car, a black sedan she would know anywhere, parked beside a silver car she didn't recognize, in a bar lot 2 miles from their house. The timestamp on the photo was 7:31, 12 minutes earlier. Calvin had texted her at 7 to say he was running behind on a quarterly projection and would eat at the office. She looked at the photo for a long moment, long enough to register everything it confirmed and everything it clarified, then set the phone face down on the workbench and finished squaring the last bracket on the far shelf. She took a level reading. The shelf was perfect. She would deal with the photo the same way she dealt with any reading that contradicted a prior assumption. Filed, deaded, revisited when the pattern clarified. The pattern clarified over the following 3 weeks. She did not confront Calvin, did not ask about the parking lot or the unrecognized car or the bone-dry toothbrush. She observed. She documented. She pulled their shared cell plan's billing summary, which she paid for and therefore had unrestricted access to, and found 18 calls to a single number in the prior month, several of them made from their own driveway at hours she had simply assumed he was finishing a work call before he came inside. She looked up the number. Simone Garrett, listed on the company's public sales roster with an office 2 floors above Calvin's, and a photo on the company website that confirmed, in the particular way a detail confirms what you'd already suspected, that the car in the parking lot photo and the woman in the profile were parts of the same fact. She cross-referenced the dates against his stated schedule and found 4 evenings accounted for by meetings that his own shared calendar confirmed had ended by 6. She found a hotel receipt from the prior month in the pocket of a jacket she'd pulled for dry cleaning. A receipt in a city 2 hours away on a weekend he'd attended a conference and come back with a toothbrush that had never been used. Her hands didn't shake compiling any of it. She printed the billing summary. She printed the photo from the unknown number. She printed the receipt and the hotel's address and the calendar screenshot. She put them all in a folder she kept in her truck's glove compartment and drove to Phyllis's office the following Tuesday morning before work. Phyllis read the folder without a single change of expression and asked one question. "Is your name the only name on the deed?" Renata confirmed it was, and that it had been since the day May transferred it, and that Calvin had never been added because May had specifically advised against it, and Renata had agreed without needing to be persuaded twice. Phyllis nodded. "Then when you're ready, the process is yours to control entirely." She walked Renata through what that meant, calmly and in sequence, the way a woman walks another woman through a plan when she's been in the room before and knows exactly where the furniture is. The house, the commercial property, and every asset held in Renata's name alone were protected from any claim by operation of Virginia law and the careful structuring May had insisted on at the estate level. What was joint was only the bank account, which Renata could take steps to address at any time she chose, and the contents of the house itself, which was a smaller question than most people assumed once they understood what was and wasn't on the deed. "The question isn't whether you have the standing to act," Phyllis said. "The question is when you want to, and what you want the morning after to look like." Renata looked at the folder on Phyllis's desk for a moment. "I'll know when," she said. She did. She called Darlene that evening from her truck in the parking lot of a grocery store, the engine running and the heat on, the way May used to call her with the important things, always from a vehicle, always where she couldn't be overheard. Darlene had been the person Renata called for every consequential thing since they were 12 years old, sharing a back seat on the way to family reunions, and she had the particular quality that made her good at it. She didn't editorialize until you were done talking, and she didn't pretend things were easier than they were once you were. Renata told her everything. Darlene said what May would have said, "Okay. Tell me what you need." Renata told her. They were on the phone for 22 minutes, and by the end of it, the shape of what came next was arranged the same way May had always arranged things. Quietly, on paper, in the right order. Through the 2 weeks that followed, Renata went home every evening and made dinner the way she always had. She asked Calvin about his week and listened to him talk about a sales quarter that was running ahead of target, which she had noted with some interest given the number of evenings that quarter he'd claimed to be at the office. She packed his lunch twice when he asked her to, the way she always had, and said nothing about Simone, or the hotel receipt, or the phone bill summary, or the conversation with Phyllis, or the one with Darlene. She was steady. She was unhurried. She had always been the most patient person in any room, and she did not see any reason to change that now, when it mattered more than it ever had before. Real power operated in quiet rooms. This was one of those rooms, and she had been in it longer than he realized. The confirmation came on a Thursday night 3 weeks after the photo. Renata had been in bed reading at 9 when Calvin texted to say the client dinner was running long and not to wait up, which she registered as information and did not reply to, since she had already noted that morning that the client dinner he described did not appear on the shared calendar he had always been careful to maintain, and that the restaurant he'd named was 3 blocks from the hotel whose receipt she'd found in the dry cleaning pocket. She set her book down and, for the first time in 3 weeks of observing and documenting, she let herself feel whatever was left. It wasn't what she expected. It wasn't grief exactly. And it wasn't rage. It was a kind of clarity, the specific kind that arrives when a number you've been carrying as an estimate finally resolves into a precise figure you can work from. She had no idea, reorganizing shelving in the garage 3 weeks earlier, that she was already this close to the morning that would make her own numbers finally add up differently. She picked up her phone and set a calendar reminder for 5 the next morning. Call Roy. She called the locksmith at 5 in the morning, after the last of the 14 unanswered calls, when it had become apparent that Calvin was not going to answer and was not coming home of his own accord, and when the particular silence on the other end of his voicemail had told her everything the documentation folder had confirmed, but not said aloud. The locksmith, a man named Roy who had done work on the commercial property twice and trusted Renata's account as the sole property owner without needing any further documentation, changed the front, side, and garage locks by 6:15 without a single unnecessary question. She had already moved Calvin's essential personal items, his wallet, which he'd left behind in a hurry the afternoon before, his second phone charger, his medications, a week's worth of clothing folded with the same care she gave everything she handled, into 2 handled bags that sat neatly on the porch beside the door. Phyllis had prepared a formal notice the week before at Renata's request. 1 page that sat on top of the bags in a sealed envelope addressed in Renata's handwriting. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with a thermos and her phone, and waited. Calvin rang the doorbell at 7:42, still in the clothes he'd left in the previous afternoon, his collar open and his face carrying 11 hours of choices he had not yet had to account for. He stood on the porch for a full minute before he understood that the door was not going to open. He knocked. He tried his key 3 times. He stepped back and looked up at the windows with the specific expression of a man whose working assumptions have all failed simultaneously. He called her phone. She watched his name appear on her screen, let it ring out, and sipped her coffee. He knocked again, louder, Renata. She could hear him through the door, his voice pitched to sound reasonable. The same tone he used when a deal was going sideways and he needed to reset the room. "I can explain. Whatever you think you know, I can explain it." She did not open the door. She did not raise her voice through it. She had prepared 1 sentence for this moment, and she said it evenly, at the volume you use when you want to be understood clearly and completely. "The envelope on the porch has everything you need. Your attorney should call Phyllis." She heard him pick up the envelope. She heard him open it. She heard the specific silence of a man reading a legal document he had not expected to exist. A man who sold things for a living and understood immediately what it meant when the paperwork had arrived before he had. Then she heard him sit down on the porch steps, because the sound of a man sitting heavily on old wood is unmistakable, and she had known those steps for 11 years. She did not feel sorry for the sound. She finished her coffee, rinsed the thermos with the same methodical care she gave every tool she used regularly, and went to get ready for work. She had no idea, 3 weeks earlier in the garage squaring that last shelf bracket, how close she already was to the morning that would finally make her own numbers add up differently. She had only known, the way May had always known, that preparation was the work, and that the morning after would be easier for every hour she'd put in before it. The morning after turned out to be easier than she'd expected, and precisely as clean as she'd planned. Phyllis filed the formal petition the following week, after Calvin's attorney had reviewed the notice and confirmed, with the particular deflation of someone encountering documentation better than they'd expected, that the house was not joint property, and that the commercial asset had never been part of the marital estate. The discovery process took 11 weeks, methodical and uncontested on the questions of property, because there was nothing to contest. Calvin's attorney spent most of the proceeding negotiating the division of the joint bank account and the terms of the support arrangement, neither of which went the way Calvin had apparently assumed they would when he'd been making other plans on the nights he wasn't home. At one point, his attorney submitted a motion suggesting that the commercial property's rental income had functionally supported the marital lifestyle and should be treated as a joint asset. Phyllis submitted May's original will, the transfer documents, and 11 years of tax returns showing the income filed under Renata's name alone. The motion was withdrawn by the end of the week. Tools were meant to work, not shine. May's paperwork had always worked. The commercial property on the south side of Richmond was reappraised the spring after the divorce was final at $1.3 million, a figure that had almost nothing to do with Renata and almost everything to do with May's habit of buying in the right zip code 20 years before the right zip code became expensive. Renata had taken on her first independent logistics consulting client that winter, a small regional carrier that needed someone who could build a documentation system from scratch, and trusted her because Roy the locksmith had mentioned her name to their facility's contact, which was the sort of referral chain May would have appreciated. Renata invoiced her first project at a rate that made her smile quietly to herself, because it was 3 times what the distribution company had ever paid her per hour, and she had always been worth it. She had someone new in her life by that summer, a quiet facilities manager named Bernard Okafor, who had called Renata's number off that same referral from Roy, needing help organizing a warehouse system that had apparently been run on memory and goodwill for 11 years and was beginning to show the cost of both. He asked questions the way Calvin once had at that logistics conference, specifically and with real attention, but where Calvin's attention had eventually migrated toward his own reflection in other people's responses. Bernard stayed exactly where he aimed it. He asked about the systems and the logic behind them, about why she resquared a level before she trusted it, rather than assuming it was still good from the last use. She told him about May and the storage operation, and the rule about measurement. He listened to the whole story without filling in the end of a single sentence before she'd finished it, and when she was done he said only, "That's a good rule," and meant it as a practical statement rather than a compliment, which struck her as exactly the right response. He didn't need to be the center of any room. He noticed what was worth noticing and left the rest alone. Word of Calvin reached Renata through Darlene, eventually, the way most things reached her. The support arrangement had turned out to be more consequential than he'd budgeted for, given that he'd apparently assumed there would be shared property to offset against it. Simone Garrett had transferred to a different regional office within 5 months of the divorce being filed, which Darlene reported without comment, and Renata received without surprise. Calvin had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood considerably farther from the office than the house had been, and was reportedly telling people that the divorce had come out of nowhere, a version of events that Darlene found less credible than most. Calvin's mother, who had attended the wedding in May's backyard and had quietly loved Renata in the way older women love women who remind them of their own better choices, told him plainly, when he tried to explain the situation, that May Bowers had built something honest, and Renata had kept it honest, and that a man who stays out all night and comes home to a changed lock has received exactly the message he earned, and that she was not going to argue with that message on his behalf. Renata heard all of it from Darlene in a single phone call on a Tuesday evening, registered it the same way she registered any resolved figure, and went back to her estimate for the warehouse project. On a Saturday morning that fall, she sat in the garage with coffee going warm beside her on the workbench. A new set of shelving brackets laid out in front of her in sequence, each one labeled in her own handwriting, and she thought of May's voice one more time. You can't manage what you haven't measured. You can't measure what you haven't documented. She had documented everything. She had measured everything. She squared the first bracket, checked the level twice, and found it exactly right. She was free. She was solvent. She had built every bit of it squarely, with a level she trusted because she always checked it twice. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.